Hi everyone. In this video, we'll talk about Part C of Chapter 9, the current account and the macroeconomy, including the causes of trade deficits. All right. NIPA is the National Income and Product Accounts. They are the set of accounts that capture all the main macroeconomic data related to GDP for a nation. That's just the name of the accounts in the United States. Every nation has equivalent accounts. We are going to derive an equation that we can use as a framework to think about. It's actually more than a framework. It's an identity equation, which means it's true by definition. So we're going to derive an equation that will help us understand the causes of trade deficits and also the relationship between several important macroeconomic variables, including private savings, government budget deficits, domestic investment, and foreign investment. You certainly don't have to memorize this equation derivation for the test, but I'm going to step through the derivation so you know where the equation came from. And there are multiple ways to get to this equation as well, but this is a common way. All right. The definition of GDP is C plus I plus G plus NX for net exports. Also, although the Gerber textbook is using X for imports and M for imports. So this last term is net exports. Gross national product is the market value of all final goods and services produced by the nation's factors of production, regardless of where they are located. GDP is limited by production that occurs within the physical borders of the United States. GNP isn't limited by the physical borders. GNP is the total amount produced by the nation's factors of production, regardless of where they are on the planet. Mathematically, GNP, and by definition, GNP is equal to GDP plus net primary income and net secondary income. Recall, those are the other components of the current account in addition to imports and exports. So these next couple equations, we're just simply rearranging these terms. So equation 9.3 says GNP is equal to C plus I plus G, and then we're separating out the NX and grouping it with the last two terms because these last three terms are the current account. So GNP is equal to this equation I've circled as equation 1. GNP in terms of income, by definition, all the income that anyone gets can be spent on three possible things. Consumption, if you don't spend it, you either save it or pay it in taxes. All of the income in the world has to go to one of those three things. So this is the definition, the income-based definition of gross national product. Because both of equation 1 and what I've labeled as equation 2 are equal to GNP, we can set those two equal to each other, do a slight bit of rearranging, subtract C from both sides, and rearrange once again, bringing the G over with the S and the T. Finally, we arrive at our equation of truth, 9.8. Private savings plus government savings, which is total national savings, is equal to investment plus the current account. This is an identity equation, which means these relationships are true by definition. A nation's savings is divided into two uses. Total national savings is divided into two uses: domestic investment and foreign investment. Another name for the current account balance is net foreign investment, and that's because of the equality of the the current account with the financial account. And the financial account represents net foreign investment. So a positive balance implies positive outward foreign investment, and negative current account balance implies that foreigners are investing more in the domestic economy than domestic residents are investing in foreign economies. So each of these four variables is partially determined by the other three, and a change in any one of these influences the others, but changes in any one of them can either be mitigated or amplified by changes in other of these variables. You'll see what I mean by that when we go through some examples talking about some of these changes. It is often the current account deficit is often discussed in terms of nations that have a current account deficit are net borrowers, and that borrowing is visible in the financial account as the inflow of capital. And nations that have a current account surplus are net savers, and they are loaning money to the rest of the world. And people often say the current account deficit is financed by U.S. capital, financed by capital flowing into the United States. But lots of the assets that comprise capital flows are not necessarily related to borrowing or debt. Many of them are purchases of land, business, and stock, so they're not borrowing. But we often discuss a current account deficit in terms of a deficit nation being a net borrower. And a nation with a current account surplus is a net saver, and that savings is financing the purchase of domestic goods by foreign users of those goods. As payment in return, those economies acquire foreign assets. Okay, let's talk about the causes of trade deficits, and this material comes from a different textbook because the Gerber textbook doesn't have a clear, straightforward discussion of the causes of trade deficits. So here is that based on notes from another book, but using the exact same equation. And it helps to think of the left-hand side as the source of funds and the right-hand side as the use of those funds. So a current account deficit is the gap or the difference between what a nation saves and what it invests. So when we think about the causes of a trade deficit, we have to think about the things that affect savings and domestic investment. Because the current account deficit is equal to the financial account deficit, when we think about the causes of trade deficits, we also have to think about the causes of financial account deficits or capital flows. Okay, so to start out, if a current account deficit is the difference between a nation's total savings and its domestic investment, then a possible cause of lower trade deficits is lower personal savings. So if domestic savings falls, domestic investment has to be funded by outside sources from foreign countries. The money has to come from somewhere. This was a contributing factor to the trade deficits in the United States in the 80s and 90s, and to some degree in the 2000s, although the U.S. savings rate has recently rebounded. Using our mathematical framework, a drop in private savings, unless the government increases savings, has less of a deficit, and makes up that shortfall, then either investment has to fall or more capital has to flow in. A major cause of trade deficits is budget deficits, or in other words, instead of lower personal savings, lower government savings. When government borrows more money and goes into deficit and spends more than it takes in tax revenue, the way it does that is by borrowing money. So if there's no change in private savings or domestic investment, then all else equal, more foreign funds are needed in total. Again, the money has to come from somewhere. So, if the government budget deficit rises, which means T minus G gets more negative, so therefore it falls, then there has to be an increase in private savings to make up for that shortfall, or else domestic investment has to fall, or else capital must flow in, which means the current account must fall or go more towards deficit, because that is saying the same thing as the financial account falls, because they are equal. Strong economic growth is another cause. So if any of you saw the David Henderson lecture last semester, one of his quotes was, "The quickest way to remove the US trade deficit is to go into a recession." So the trade deficit changes with the business cycle. When the economy is booming and we're experiencing economic growth, the trade deficit increases. That is because with a growing, healthy economy, it offers higher returns, so that induces capital to flow in. So that hits the financial account deficit, increases the financial account deficit. And also, people tend to purchase more imports, which increases the current account deficit. In the framework of equation 9.8, the equation of truth, you can think about strong economic growth as an investment boom, so investment going up. If domestic investment rises, and if there's no increase in private savings to fund that investment, or no increase in government savings to fund that investment, then it has to come from foreigners, which means capital has to flow in, so the current account has to fall, which is the same thing as the financial account falling, meaning capital flows in. A couple key points. A nation's current account balance is equal to the difference between its savings and its investment. A current account deficit is caused by other countries wanting to invest in your economy as opposed to buying your goods and services. So, related to the economic growth aspect, cause of trade deficits, I thought this was a helpful, interesting article that helped explain why that is. So this is copy-pasted from the source I have linked, and it essentially explains the relationship between the business cycle and the trade deficit. Every time there is a recession in recent times, the trade deficit gets bigger. So here, the 91 recession, actually that is an exception. The trade deficit's getting bigger during that one. Okay, and here's the 91 recession. Trade deficit shrinks. Shrunk a little bit right before the 2001 recession. That was a short one. And it drastically shrunk during the recession of 2007, 2009. The explanation for this lies mainly in imports. So when real GDP increase, so do imports. When the economy is doing well, producers need more intermediate goods, and imports are mostly intermediate goods. Also, households consume more, and a share of those consumption goods are imports. Exports depend much more on what happens abroad, which isn't correlated with domestic business cycle activity. So there's another explanation for causes of the trade deficit. Here I'll take just a few more minutes to point out some of the things in this section of the chapter, and one or two of these might be slightly redundant, but they are important enough that they bear repeating. Again, from this equation, we can see, ceteris paribus, a country that has a large budget deficit or low domestic savings will typically have low investment. The United States is an exception to that correlation. We have high investment despite having an enormous government budget deficit and low domestic savings. That is because the US is viewed as a safe haven economy and a lucrative, relatively politically, economically stable economy to invest in historically. A current account deficit lets a country invest more than it would otherwise. We've already discussed that. But it also allows the government to run a budget deficit. If it weren't for a current account deficit and foreign investment, maybe private savings wouldn't be enough to fund the budget deficit. Countries that want to eliminate the current account deficit, or in other words, eliminate a trade deficit, have to do at least one of the following or some combination. So, if we are decreasing part of the use of the funds, then we would have less capital flowing in. If the current account deficit goes down, that means we would either have to decrease our domestic investment or start to fund more of our domestic investment with our own domestic private savings, or the government would have to stop running such a large budget deficit. And that, unfortunately, can only be achieved by raising taxes or cutting government spending. Old-fashioned arithmetic there. Private savings has several jobs. We've talked about the two jobs, financing domestic investment and financing foreign investment, but also private savings finances the government budget deficit. When the government budget deficit rises, then at least one of the following or some combination has to occur. The money has to come from somewhere. It either has to come from a rise in domestic private savings, or it has to be funded by foreigners, in which case capital flows in, so the current account moves lower towards deficit, or we have to give up some funding towards domestic investment. It's impossible to simultaneously increase the budget deficit and decrease the trade deficit unless you have a gargantuan increase in private savings, which is what some certain politician has been trying to do lately. Okay, this is a key point from the back of the textbook related to this part of the material. There's a fundamental economic identity that total private and public saving in an economy must be equal to domestic investment plus net foreign investment. The current account is equal to net foreign investment, and a negative balance is equivalent to disinvestment abroad. In other words, a negative imbalance is equivalent to positive investment from foreigners abroad. And foreigners are investing more in the domestic economy than domestic citizens and residents are investing in foreign economies if you have a negative current account. All right, so if the current account is in deficit, capital is flowing in. If the current account is in surplus, capital is flowing out.